Chapter 10. By noon of the second day, the caravan was so close to the sea that Elspeth could smell the salt in the air. Despite the camaraderie of the night before, Nika had returned to her sullen self. At daybreak, as the caravan was preparing to leave, Nika had asked Elspeth if she could walk up the line of wagons to speak to Beta. But when she returned a few minutes later, her eyes were red from crying. As the caravan rolled out of the mountains and into the rolling meadowland, she'd stayed in the caravan with the doors and shutters closed. But at midday, she climbed out of the van and walked beside Elspeth. The mountains receded behind them. They traveled through lush fields and stands of old forest. At the crest of each hill, Elspeth could see the blue sea sparkling on the horizon.
"Gina says we're close now," Elspeth said. "We'll be in Miletus before nightfall."
Nika shrugged.
"Are you all right?" Elspeth asked.
"I hate him," Nika said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the caravan where Beta traveled. Elspeth wasn't sure what to say, and before she had to decide, the drivers shouted down the line to halt the caravan near a stream in a dark grove of trees. Elspeth went into the wagon and emptied the sack for some dry provisions for the midday meal. But when she climbed out, Nika had wandered across the road and a short distance into the trees. Elspeth laid down the food and crossed over to her. Elspeth was glad they were so close to the sea. Once they were safely on the ship, Nika couldn't wander off anymore. Nika crouched in front of a small tower of moss-covered stones. She picked up a stick and scratched a mark in the dirt.
"What's that?" Elspeth asked. "I think it's a shrine to Nylea," Nika told her. "Have you ever seen the Great Hunter?" "Just in mosaics. And remember, your father doesn't want you praying at shrines. Nylea is strong. Back at home, all my friends wanted to give her offerings and get her favor. But she doesn't like cities, and she doesn't like shrines." "Then why does she have one here?" Elspeth asked.
Nika stood up abruptly and stared up at the treetops. Elspeth looked up too, curious at what had caught the girl's attention. Across the road, 3 giant black crows were perched on a thin branch above, staring directly at them. Nika frowned at the birds, and she backed away with her hands up as if in surrender. Elspeth's brain felt muddled, like she couldn't quite remember something. Her vision wavered. Or was the forest slipping sideways? Elspeth felt very tired and confused. She must not have slept well on the hard floor of the wagon. It was surreal to watch Nika walking backward while her gaze flitted between Elspeth and the crows. Puzzled, Elspeth realized that she was now sitting on the ground with her hands digging into the soft earth. Why was she there? And where was Nika? The ground looked very appealing, and she thought she might just lie down. Through the trees, she saw Guinness and his men had also dropped sleepily to the ground where they had been standing. Even the horses were bowing their heads, their noses just inches from the ground.
"Are you tired?"
Nika asked. She sounded far away.
Yes,"
Elspeth murmured.
"I think I'll just rest a moment."
When Elspeth's head hit the dirt, Nika spun on her heel. Beta came out from behind a wagon and grabbed Nika's hand, and the two of them plunged into the trees. Somewhere in Elspeth's mind, she knew she had to fight the sleep spell. She was also struggling with the knowledge that Nika was a mage, but her thoughts were being suffocated by the sleep magic. Master Takis had warned her that his daughter was clever, but to put an entire caravan to sleep, that took the skill of an accomplished spellcaster. Had she been lying about the fight with Veda just to distract Elspeth? As if in slow motion, Elspeth tried to remember a spell to ward off the unconsciousness, but her last waking memory was of a group of men in black hoods and cloaks sweeping up the road toward the line of wagons. They each carried a coiled whip with bronze plating. The men searched briefly through the bodies on the road and hastened into the trees in the same direction that Nika and Beta had gone. Elspeth was hidden from view by the underbrush, and they never glanced in her direction. Then she slept and didn't dream. The next thing she knew, cold water sloshed against her face. A sobbing Nika held an empty flask. Her white dress was now covered in blood.
"They killed Beta," Nika cried, dropping the flask to the dirt. "Erebos' agent stabbed him."
Elspeth sat up. Her head felt as if it had been stuffed full of spiderwebs. Her fingers were stiff and cold, but she managed to pick up her blade, which was next to her, on the forest floor.
"Did you make me sleep?"
Elspeth tried to say, but her tongue was as heavy as a stone.
"Yes, I'm so sorry," Nika sobbed. "Who killed Beta?"
Elspeth asked. Nika gave a little yelp of panic and dragged Elspeth to her feet. The girl was surprisingly strong.
"We have to go," she cried. "They're coming back."
The air felt cold and unpleasant, and there was no sun shining down through the trees. Nika supported Elspeth's weight as they made their way back to the caravan on the road. Nearby, Guinness had climbed to his feet and rubbed his face wearily. A few of his men were also coming to their senses.
"Erebos desires oracles," Nika told Elspeth. "He wishes to possess them and kidnaps them down into the underworld. And the harpies saw. They told him where we were going." "Is there an oracle here?" Elspeth asked stupidly.
Guinness was stumbling toward them.
"Are you dense?"
Nika cried out in frustration. A cold wind blew through the grove and rattled the canvas coverings of the wagons. The velvet curtains of the Takis caravan swayed back and forth.
"Is there?"
Elspeth asked again.
"Why did you think I was going to the academy?"
Nika asked.
"You're an oracle,"
Elspeth asked. Wearily, she leaned on her blade as if it was a staff. Guinness shouted and pointed down the road where they had come. A dark shape moved toward them, cloaked in mist. Elspeth couldn't discern what it was, but it was accompanied by a harsh sound, like the clattering of teeth. An unnatural sense of dread swept over all who heard the sound. The fear rushed through Elspeth, and it snapped her awake.
"I need to get her to safety," Elspeth said to Guinness. "Something is coming for her."
"Run to the coast," Guinness said, pointing down the road. "Ships are waiting there."
"Will Erebos' men be able to follow us onto the water?"
Elspeth asked no one in particular.
"Not without Thesa's blessing,"
Guinness said. He motioned to two of the drivers who were awake and gaping at the approaching darkness.
"Go with them and help them safely to Miletus."
"What about you?"
Elspeth asked.
"I'm not leaving my caravan,"
Guinness said, drawing his weapon.
"Now go!"
The four of them sprinted down the great river road for the ocean. By the time they'd left the grove, the sky was dark and roiling with silver clouds. As they ran, Elspeth kept glancing behind them. She expected to see an enemy bearing down on them, but the road was eerily silent. It was less than a mile to the coast, but Elspeth felt like her lungs were about to explode by the time they reached the edge of the sea. Two large ships waited in the harbor, and a small boat for boarding was beached on the sand. The larger vessels appeared deserted, like ghost ships bobbing on the waves.
"We'll take the boarding boat,"
the stable boy ordered. He had dark curly hair and a round face and sounded more authoritative than he looked.
"We don't have enough bodies to sail the larger ships."
They shoved the boat onto the sparkling water and clambered inside as the sun peeked out and disappeared again behind the fast-moving clouds. There were only two sets of oars, and the boys grabbed them and began rowing. They obviously knew their way around a boat, so Nika and Elspeth sat out of the way in the bow. The boys took them out of a few 100 feet away from the shore, and then began to skirt the coastline. Dark shapes circled in the water below them, and trailed behind the boat.
"What are those?"
Elspeth asked, looking down. "Theros tritons," the other young man said. He looked a little older and had blue-gray eyes. "They watch and tell her about all who desire passage over her realm. We should be at the mouth of Meletis harbor within the hour," the curly-haired boy assured them. "I think we're safe. There's no one set sail behind us. Are you injured, Lady Takis?" Nika didn't answer. She stared at the storm clouds on the horizon.
Are you injured?
Elspeth asked. Nika shook her head almost imperceptibly. Tears ran down her cheeks. The girl knew she had just gotten Beta killed, and maybe more people at the caravan, but Elspeth wasn't going to press her for details. Not yet, anyway.
"She's all right,"
Elspeth assured the young man, even though that was far from the truth. The Tritons followed at a safe distance. The wind blew harder, and the seas grew choppier with every passing minute. Finally, on the horizon, two massive statues loomed from the coastline.
"Is that Meletis?"
she called to the young men.
"What are those statues?"
"Those are two of the guardians," said the gray-eyed boy. "They're monuments of great heroes that protect Meletis from the east and from the west."
"And Meletis is just beyond the statues?"
Elspeth asked.
"Not quite. They're at the mouth of the river. We have to pass the Four Winds Plateau. Then it's just a short sail to the sea gate of the city."
"Why is there no—"
Nika interrupted. The young man looked up to where the clouds had darkened the skies directly above them. The clouds were like a tower for roiling darkness that could hide multitudes within it. A guard could be watching, plotting from its depths. Elspeth realized how little she knew about the beings that held dominion over this world.
"Something's wrong,"
the young man muttered. He leaned over the side and dipped his fingers into the flat water and began speaking a prayer to Thesa.
"I think Thesa is listening,"
Nika whispered to Elspeth.
"but not to him." "What do you mean?"
Elspeth asked.
"The wind was silenced so Thesa can hear the words of Erebos," Nika said. "He's told her where to find us."
Elspeth felt a chill of dread.
"Why would she care? Does she want oracles too?"
"No," Nika said.
"I can't imagine that she would want me. This isn't about me anymore."
Nika turned on her bench and pointed to the southwest out into the vastness of the ocean. A giant wall of water had risen on the horizon. The young men craned their necks and saw it too. They sprang into action, yelling out commands to each other as they frantically rowed for shore.
"What is it about?"
Elspeth cried. Nika reached out and took Elspeth's hand in her clammy fingers.
"It's about you."
Though still a great distance away, the wave swept across the flat sea. With the speed it traveled, the boat would soon be engulfed. There was no way they would make it to shore in time. Elspeth thought desperately of what spell might save them all from drowning.
"I can help us,"
Nika said, still clutching Elspeth's hand. The flat water rose up around the gunwales of the boat. The water churned into the shapes of horses' heads, and white foam rose to their chests. The elemental horses lifted the vessel on their backs and carried the boat to shore faster than the wave approached them. They thundered onto shore and deposited the boat high above the sandy beach on a rocky ledge. The watery horses quickly transformed back into mundane waves and flowed back into the sea, leaving the boat 50 feet above the ocean. The young men jumped over the sides, shouting with joy. The curly-haired boy raised his arms to the sky and yelled, "Thank you, kind deliverer!" Elspeth helped Nika out of the boat. The girl shook with exhaustion.
"He should be thanking you," she said softly. "No, don't say anything. I don't want anyone to know."
Elspeth nodded. There were few who understood the sentiment better than she. She looked out over the ocean, The titanic wave raced for shore and seemed to be gathering height and speed. Thesa wasn't going to stop just because they were on dry ground.
Does that make up for what I did before in the glade? Nika asked,
but Elspeth was too distracted by the sight of the accelerating wave to respond. It was as if the entire ocean had risen up to flood the world.
Are we high enough? Elspeth asked. I've made an enemy of Thesa now, Nika said sadly. Of all the gods, it's always been her voice that I heard the loudest of all.
Elspeth scanned the landscape behind them. The boat had come to rest on a wide ledge halfway up a rocky slope, with small trees clinging to it. Over the top of the slope, she could see the 2 stone swords of the guardians. If the statues were on the other side of this slope, then they weren't that far from the safety of Meletis.
Come on, let's get to higher ground, Elspeth urged the young men who stood at the cliff's edge transfixed by the spectacle.
Thesa can't reach us up here, the curly-haired boy said. Elspeth wasn't so sure. She grabbed at Nika's elbow, and the 2 of them scrambled up the rocky slope. They were nearly to the top when the wave hit the shore. It slammed into the cliff face under the boys, but it traveled upward unnaturally. It arced over the boys, devouring them and dragging them down. The water headed straight for Elspeth and Nika. At the crest of the wave, the ocean had become like grasping hands, reaching out to claim them for the sea.
Climb!
Elspeth screamed. They struggled over the sharp rocks as the waves roared in their ears and battered against their legs. Elspeth felt the watery hands tugging at her. She shoved Nika up the slope ahead of her. The girl managed to break free of the water and pulled herself onto the trunk of a dead tree with its roots barely clinging to the slope. Nika reached down and tried to grab Elspeth.
Take my hand, Nika called.
Unexpectedly, the girl's eyes rolled back in her head, and she spoke in a god voice that was not her own.
I am Thesa, and you are a thief. I claim your blade in the name of the god of the forge. I claim your life in the name of mine. Fight her, Elspeth cried to the girl. You are Nika, claimed by no one, beholden to none but yourself.
Desperately, Elspeth drove her spear blade between the roots of the tree and clung to it while the sea tore at her. It felt like she was being stretched on a torture rack. Pain addled her mind as she desperately cast a spell to free Nika, but the girl wasn't afflicted by control magic. Thesa was using Nika as a mouthpiece, not a puppet. Like a hand brushing away cobwebs, Elspeth skillfully swept the magic from the girl's mind. Nika's eyes returned to normal, and she glared angrily at the sea. The water receded, and Elspeth climbed up beside Nika and worked her blade free from the tangle of wet roots. A gray rain began to fall around them. Nika held out her hand to catch the drops, and they saw it wasn't rain at all. It was gray ash, as fine as powder. The sound of a distant explosion jostled the slope beneath them.
Are they gone?
Nika cried. The placid sea lapped the shoreline below them. Once again, an uncomprehending force of nature. The boys from the caravan were nowhere to be seen.
We're almost to the top, Elspeth said. Let's get to the city.